Winnipeg, it is playoff time. Almost.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, Jets fans, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we have some fun stuff to recap from the past couple of days of Jets hockey. Apologies, my recording schedule the past couple of weeks has been a little bit crazy. I'm going to be traveling a lot over the next few weeks, so we might be in and out a little bit more than I'd like, but hopefully towards the end of April, things will quiet down as we enter the playoff stretch. But obviously, the Jets don't stop, and Winnipeg was, last week very much in the driver's seat, although, I think a lot of people had questions about whether or not we'd see, against the Calgary Flames, the same lineup that the Jets used a couple of nights previously against the LA Kings. And there were some questions, right? Would Bones go back to the well? Would he make some changes? Would he do the kinds of stuff that he usually does against teams like that? Would he kind of go back to his old preferred lineups? We'll talk about that and what he did in game against Calgary in just a moment. Before we go ahead of ourselves, though, I just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, like I said, the Jets, against Calgary, I think a lot of us were expecting a game that wasn't going to be too crazy. Well, at least on paper. The Flames are bad recently, and quite honestly, the Jets are the kind of team that, if they're playing well, should be able to wipe the floor with them. But we know that against Calgary, things have gotten heated, and it's never quite been that straightforward. Every time the Jets play teams like Montreal or Calgary or any of these annoying, pesky teams that may lack in high-end talent, they just somehow annoy the crap out of the Jets. And in Calgary's case, they constantly try to injure our players. I don't know what it is with Calgary and headshots or whatever, but there were like 3 instances of, players going for elbows and stuff. It actually got Martin Pospisil ejected. And if you remember Pospisil, he has injured Cole Perfetti before, so not exactly a fan favorite among the Jets fans, I'll tell you. If there's a player that I'd really like to see less of in this league, it is Pospisil. He honestly shouldn't really be playing. He doesn't deserve to play in this league, and it's, a bit of a shame that he continues to do this kind of stuff, because there's probably a reality where he'd actually play fourth line minutes if he wasn't getting himself suspended every 3 games. But maybe the Flames want that. I don't know. Either way, he'll probably have some sort of a nasty suspension incoming, and he'll deserve it. He said he had learned and changed his ways, but guess what? He tried to elbow Morrissey, so clearly that message didn't sink in. As far as this game was concerned, though, this was a tale of a couple of different periods. The first period, the Jets came out with the same lineup, and things were fast. They were frenetic, although it did take the Jets a little bit to warm up. And as they started warming up to the task, Winnipeg started to look a little bit better. But, obviously, first couple of shifts, there are some growing pains with this team at times. And, it was a little bit of a slow start, but as the Jets again started to warm up, things started to seem relatively okay. And then into the second period, Bones did his patented let's swap Ehlers and Connor move, which I don't understand why he thought this would work. We know that Connor-Scheifele and Vilardi don't really work well together. And I don't think it needs to be one of those situations where you can blame it on a small sample size. We know that Connor and Scheifele together already struggle, so why toss Vilardi into this mix? Like, I like Gabriel, right? He's a great player. He had a hat trick in this game, but the reality is, in terms of like helping Connor and Scheifele work together, that's not really what he excels at. And I think, looking at the body of work that this line has generally put together, it is bad enough to say, well, let's not do that again. So, the Jets, for the about 15 to 20 minutes that you saw that trio together, they kind of got shelled. And towards the end of the period, Bones went back to Scheifele-Vilardi and Connor, Monahan, and Perfetti. And would you know it? The Jets ended up winning 5-2 and dominated the rest of the game after that point. So, there's a bit of a lesson in there. Don't switch up what's working well, right? Unless there's some reason to really go back to the old lines because you're not finding some level of offense that you think this team needs to unlock. I can understand why you might switch it out, but I think in Winnipeg's case, it's better to be on the side of caution here and just roll with a good top six. I think Winnipeg has finally found two top lines that play really well. They score at a pretty good rate. They, dominate control of the ice, and they give the Jets a lot more matchup variability. So don't leave it behind and go back to old lines that we know don't work. Stick with the plan, stick with the whole process, and I think you will see this team get rewarded more often than not. And I think in this game, they definitely got rewarded. There were some really nice shifts from, the top nine. In terms of weak points, I guess you might look at, in particular, Neil Pionk. I think he had a really rough game. Unfortunate, and I don't really like to call him out like that, but, Pionk, it's been a really tough last few months, and now that he's being asked to play alongside Josh Morrissey, I have some thoughts about that, but I'll save that for a different time. I think you know my thoughts about this anyways. You've heard me talk about Pionk before. It's been a little bit of a rough season for him. But in terms of positives, we had some points from Cole Perfetti, Sean Monahan, Kyle Connor together. That's nice. Obviously, the top line went off. Ehlers had a goal and also an assist. Gabriel Vilardi had a hat trick. Morrissey had a couple of points. Hellebuyck had a big showing. All in all, just a really nice game, and I think for the Jets, a very straightforward victory, right? The template for winning against Calgary was going to be stay out of the box and win at 5v5, and they did just that. Aside from the stretch where Bones temporarily decided to shake things up in a way that didn't really shake anything up. In fact, it just made things much worse. The Jets kind of won comfortably, and this was a big win because obviously it clinched a playoff spot. And for Winnipeg, I think that was priority number one, right? Take care of business, control your own destiny. And with everything that's happened in the Central over the past couple of games, it actually is still to play for. And Winnipeg could potentially put itself in the driver's seat for playoff seeding. Now, I don't think the Central Division title is necessarily in play, right? I think that is probably a little bit beyond Winnipeg right now with only a few games left, like 5 games total. Obviously, they played Minnesota today, and tomorrow, or today's episode that we're going to have a double feature today. The second episode, we'll talk about that game and some takeaways from that. But in terms of chasing the Stars, right, 5 points in 5 games is actually a pretty sizable margin and gap to close unless Dallas really slips. If the Jets were to somehow take first place, then you start looking at maybe facing one of Vegas or Nashville, which, if I'm being honest, I don't know if I want to face either of those teams above the Avs. Colorado may have just lost Mikko Rantanen for a while, and the goaltending situation for the Avs doesn't look so great. So a lot to consider here. Obviously, over the next couple of games, we'll have a better sense of who the Jets will play. But yeah, man. A lot to play for here over the next few weeks, and as the season winds down, the Jets are going to be focused on the playoffs. But I wanted to take a moment and talk about Gabriel Vilardi and what he's really brought to this team, especially now that he's starting to get healthy again, and that he looks like he is finding his groove alongside Ehlers and Scheifele. We'll get into that in just a moment and how he earned his amazing hat trick. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has your back. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge victories. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode as we are naturally chatting about Winnipeg. And, obviously they've had a couple of games since we last spoke, but in the game against the Flames, I think one particular player stood out above the rest, and that's, Gabriel Vilardi, who scored his first career hat trick, which honestly, I didn't even realize it was his first career hat trick. I thought he might have had one with LA before, but apparently not. So huge career milestone for a very young player with a bright, promising future. And hopefully, if his health stays, up to par, he'll have a long career. But, for the first time in, the past couple of games, he has started to look a little more like himself. And I think this game was a perfect encapsulation of what makes him so brilliant and so dangerous. We'll talk about that in just a sec. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to let you know that the Locked On Network has a really cool alternative to Fox Sports or ESPN. If you listen to these channels and you find you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, well, maybe you should make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Be sure to find Locked On Sports Today, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Gabriel Vilardi has been an interesting player for the Jets. I think most would immediately say that they are, quite a bit happier with him than they are with Dubois. And in a lot of ways, if you hear what people say about Vilardi and how he plays, it actually ticks off a lot of the boxes of what people thought Dubois would be. A menace down low, super skilled with hand-eye coordination, a big physical presence in the corners, somebody with a tough streak without necessarily being dirty and cheap shoddy, but a guy who's not afraid to mix it up in the corners, win wall battles, and occasionally physically engage and win those duels. And that's what Vilardi has done. But I think what I find most interesting about him is how often he gets lost in plays. And I don't mean that in terms of him losing track of something or forgetting where he is. No, it's actually opponents forgetting where Vilardi is and not realizing that he is right on the back door ready for a tap-in. If ever there was a guy that I would qualify as an elite tap-in merchant, it is Gabriel Vilardi. And I think that at first might come across as insulting. With Vilardi, I actually think he makes it an art form. The way that he understands timing and space for those plays is almost second to none on this team, right? If Ehlers is an expert at space in the outer perimeter and how to exploit that, Vilardi is the kind of guy who makes the crease his home. He's constantly looking for nice deflections and tips, but he's also extremely comfortable using his excellent hand-eye coordination and stick handling in close when he's trying to dangle around goalies, or in other cases, maybe he just goes for a beautiful release because he's got a very strong shot. But the other thing that he's an expert at is, say he's on the power play. Maybe he'll try and, drag the puck from down low around the keeper, maybe set up a great pass for a tap-in for his line mates, or more frequently, he often finds himself on those backdoor opportunities where he just taps it home. And he had one of those that was a little more central to the slot, but certainly in that crease area where he likes to make his living, it was a bit of a tip deflection off of him, and it just went and slid through. And a great goal for Vilardi, right? I think a very hard-earned one. I think it's exactly the showcase of how he's been. And while he hasn't exactly had the sort of 5v5 results with Connor-Scheifele that you might expect, with Ehlers and Scheifele, it's a very different story. It's like he just fits them perfectly, right? His ability to navigate in space, his powerful strides and physical frame are a great kind of counterbalance to the way that Ehlers and Scheifele like to work around the slot and the perimeter. Vilardi is one of those guys who will just sort of glide around and kind of be a roaming threat. And I really enjoy the way that he works and sort of gets himself into the low crease area, the low slot area, to essentially just deflect things home, try and find those good scoring opportunities, and be a general box-out menace. He's also a big screen presence, and I think that has also reflected itself at times on the power play. But just whatever you've asked of him, he's been really great. And I think in a lot of ways, if he had played at center, maybe the perception around him would have been different in terms of like what he's capable of at center. I think, at wing is kind of where he makes his real bread and butter. He's also pretty good in transition, even if his transition work is not necessarily his strongest suit, but he is a very, very good difference maker at 5v5. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think he's actually on pace to outscore Dubois at the end of the season, which is pretty crazy because, like, we also got Kupari and, of course, Iafallo tossed in there. Iafallo has 11 goals. And while points aren't the be-all, end-all of everything, obviously having a really good PKer who's fit in quite beautifully on the fourth line, I've got to say, is, a little bit of extra added value for the Jets for a guy who might have been an afterthought in LA. So, overall, really impressed with Vilardi. I think, Iafallo has certainly a bit of a nice little niche role that he's played for this team, even if he's maybe lacking a little bit of that extra offensive touch. In terms of what Vilardi has done on paper for the Jets this year, 33 points in 42 games, and if he was to have a much fuller season, he'd probably be hitting that 60-point mark pretty easily, which for a player who wasn't going to extend with LA and was certainly on the outs, he's basically doing what we kind of asked of Dubois, but perhaps even at a higher level. When he's engaged and at the top of his game and on a line that's not defensively submarine the whole time, Vilardi is really impressive, and I've been enjoying watching him. I think he's got great skill down low, extremely good presence of mind when he's tapping home pucks, and just a really fun player to watch. And again, like I said, I think in a lot of ways he was everything that I wanted Pierre-Luc Dubois to be, but perhaps just in a different position. He plays a little more out wide, whereas Dubois goes down the middle. Dubois actually, in 77 games, has 39 points this year, which is like pretty mediocre, if we're being honest. For the Jets, maybe Vilardi can somehow outpace that in the final couple of games here. Not inconceivable that he actually catches that based on how good the Jets' top line has been. And this is going to be a very tough test over the next few weeks because Winnipeg still has a tough stretch through the remainder of the Central. And, the good news is they've started it off with a win against the Wild, right? But, the next few opponents are a lot harder. And I think for the Jets, a really big test as they are trying to figure out what sort of team they are heading into the postseason. And kind of on that note, I just wanted to talk about what is now remaining for the Jets to sort out. Winnipeg has mostly got things locked down at forward, but I think there are a couple of questions with other parts of the lineup that Winnipeg has yet to quite nailed down. We'll talk about what remains for the Jets to sort out in just a moment. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood is the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us with these closing thoughts as we're just talking about the Jets kind of now clinching the playoff spot and still dueling for a potential, I wouldn't say Central Division crown, but perhaps better Central Division seeding. At this point, Winnipeg's main focus is home ice advantage, which, having the first 2 games against, say, Colorado is a big deal at home, right? Starting off your games on home soil where you've got the advantage, where you don't have to travel as much, where you get to train on home ice, and you have the crowd on your side a little bit more, especially in the opening 2 games of a very tough series, really is an advantage you can't overstate. And I think for the Jets, home ice has been a huge blessing for this team. Not that they have a bad record outside of it, but if you look at Winnipeg's home form, it is just a tad better, right? Like, make no mistake, this team has won tons of games on the road, but that extra little 3-game advantage or so could be a nice little thing to consider when you're thinking about Winnipeg coming home and having a boisterous whiteout crowd that's going to be absolutely rollicking at home, right? And with, Colorado's goaltending this year a little bit in a bit of a downswing and their road form much worse than their home form, you want to take on the Avs on your own soil. This is definitely a thing that I think would really impact and swing, the favor for the Jets in this series. If you look at Colorado's home record, they are 29-7-1. Sounds really great, right? But then you look at their away record, 19-16-5. We know that the Jets are better equipped to win on the road, but at home, they're also really good. And I think that's where they can kind of take advantage of a bit of a slightly inconsistent, but still really good Avs team. Make no mistake, though, Colorado has been rolling recently, and I think that is a very tough opponent for the Jets heading into the postseason. So any little bit of a break that you can get against this team, you absolutely have to take. They have almost identical records. But, over the next few weeks, the Jets are going to play them, and this could be a good chance to steal that second spot in the Central and put yourself in the driver's seat for home ice advantage in round 1 of the playoffs. Now, I mentioned that there were some questions lingering around the Jets. I think at forward, we only have one question, and that's who comes out when Niederreiter is back. I would probably look at one of Barron or Appleton. We know Appleton's not getting scratched. That's never happening. So I would say Barron probably becomes the odd man out. I really would prefer, though, that they keep the top 6 as is. Even if you get to Foley somewhere in your middle 6, just leave him on the third line. I think, that should be fine, right? Niederreiter, Lowry, and Toffoli together should be a great trio. Don't mess with the second line. Perfetti, Monahan, and Connor play really well off of each other. They have been scoring already and doing some really good work as a follow-up line to the top line. Leave the top 6. Have an elite third line with Lowry, Niederreiter, and Toffoli that adds that extra finishing element. And then have, a third line or a fourth line of like Nemesnikov, Iafallo, and Appleton or something. That would be an elite trio as your fourth line matchup. You'd have 4 really good lines to roll and deploy in almost any situation. Now, on the back end, that is where you have bigger questions, right? We've seen rotations with Sandberg, Stanley, Miller. There's been a lot of guys cycling in and out of the third pairing, Schmidt as well. And that's where I feel like there's been enough instability to make you wonder where Bones is kind of leaning, right? Stanley drew in for the game against Minnesota, which was fine. I think actually I'll talk about this on the other episode today, but I thought he looked pretty good, pretty comfortable moving the puck and generally, unhurried when he was making good, clean plays. But in terms of the other parts of this team, on the back end, I think Pionk, for me, on the first pairing, has to be an adjustment the Jets make. Pionk, he definitely, he doesn't struggle with effort, right? That's never been his thing. It's more like outcome and results. That's where he has had really big issues. And I think some of the goals that were conceded in this game against the Wild and in Calgary, you could look at as mistakes that were kind of on Pionk. And look, I love Neil. I think he's a guy who, fights for the badge. He wears his heart on his sleeve, and he's always been accountable for what he feels his level of performance is. But at some point, you've got to stop giving him really tough matchup minutes. I think this is where you can draw down those minutes and just put DeMello back on the first pair. I don't think Bones will do this, but I do think it would help the Jets a lot if you had Morrissey and DeMello back as your number 1 pairing. When those guys work with the top line, they are almost unstoppable, and it starts to create that rolling effect where all of the other lines keep working together. Pionk, when he's on the ice, even with Morrissey, it's just a chaotic mess. As much as I enjoy what Josh has done this year, he can't even cover for Pionk's turnovers and bad reads. And it's a shame. Like I said, it's never been a question of Pionk's effort for me. It's just that he really does struggle with some of these defensive reads. His outlet passes can be a bit of a struggle. And for all of the work and stuff that he does, it just doesn't lead to much that's productive, which is strange to say about a guy who has a relentless engine and throws some really big hip checks. Unfortunately, it just doesn't bear out in big results on the ice. And I think a lot of people recently, especially the past 2 seasons, have kind of seen why a lot of us are like, let's slow down on how many minutes you feed him. You might want to slow down and maybe dial those top five, blue line minutes a little bit more in check. I think it's a little too high right now, and asking him to be on the first pairing with Morrissey is a lot more responsibility than would probably be appropriate for the role that would make the most sense for him. If you put him with like Sandberg on the third pair, I think that would actually be really good, and I think it would also help him against softer matchups. You give him easier workloads, but a really competent pairing partner who's probably good enough to help him with some of the defensive issues. I think you get a lot more mileage out of this lineup. But it is what it is. The Jets are probably not going to change this, barring a surprise. But even the media has kind of picked up on it. And when the media starts pressing about it, you sometimes see Bones make that switch. So keep an eye out for that against the upcoming games that the Jets have. It did not happen against the Wild, but it may happen, maybe, against one of Nashville, Dallas, or Colorado. But like I said, we're gonna just have to wait and see what happens. Obviously, as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, we'll have a recap from Minnesota on another episode coming out today, a doubleheader. Like I said, sorry that my schedule this past week has been a little bit crazy for recording. I did want to record while I was on the road, but unfortunately the lighting and stuff just wasn't that great. So back on home soil at least for a couple more days, and we'll have some more Jets content and previews coming up because, of course, Winnipeg has a very big game against the Nashville Predators coming up this Tuesday. So get hyped for that. But in between, we'll have the recap of Winnipeg versus Minnesota later today. So don't go anywhere. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. And as always, have a great night and go Jets go.